It's lovely to meet everybody. So we've got our bios available, so I won't read the bios of our folks to you because we have a pretty short amount of time. But we have Claire Foulquier-Gazagnes, member of the board at Current AI, Michele Jawando from the Omidyar Network, Venkatesh Hariharan, India representative from the Open Invention Network, and Jeremy Rollison, head of EU policy at Microsoft. And so very happy to be here with all of you. I'm going to get started by noting that last year's panel really discussed bridging the data divide, AI tools for making data easier to consume, emerging models of data collaboration like data commons and marketplaces. And this year we're going to be looking at, and of course, a lot of stuff has happened in that space over the last year. But this year, what we're going to focus on is exploring incentives for data collaboration, sustaining efforts to combine open data and AI, and protecting global access to open data. And so, Claire, the first question will go to you, which is drawing on your experiences working in France's Chief Data Officer team and your recent work at Current AI. What do you think is the role of data in assuring public interest AI and evolution of the open data space?
Thank you so much, John, and really happy to join all of you. I'm really pleased to be there because, as you mentioned, this is very much a moment where I'm closing one loop of my career. 10 years ago, I was working in the French government's open data team. And today, and I was working and negotiating to release a lot of open data sets. And today I'm working on building Current AI, which is an initiative that was announced at the Paris AI Action Summit that has raised a lot of money, so over $400 million, to put AI in the service of public interest, but specifically by focusing on financing the building block of AI. And one of those building blocks is data. So yeah, this is really coming full circle for me. So happy to be there. So to answer, yeah, you wanted to come? Someone wanted
Go ahead.
To
I was going to ask you a follow-up, but go ahead.
I'm torn now, but I was going to answer the question you asked, and yeah, maybe let's. But yeah, feel free to jump in anytime. So coming back to your question, the role of data for me is not just important; it's truly foundational, in the sense that I'm sure that without high quality and diverse data, we cannot have public interest AI. This simply does not exist. And I will give you one example of this, which is the work that was like last year in the news around this time. The chemistry Nobel Prize was awarded to AlphaFold to predict the protein structure. But what was less talked about is how this work came to be. And this work was only possible because since the 70s, the Worldwide Protein Data Bank was being maintained under a no rights reserve license. And under this license, more than 200K protein structure in 3D were collected, harvested, checked to create this amazing high quality data set. And because of this, then protein structure prediction was able to happen. And we had that scientific breakthrough, but it all started with that data set. And that's also our theory of change at Current AI, that we need the creation of more of these high quality and diverse data sets that will then make truly artificial intelligence in the service of public interest. I believe in your question, there was also a second part on where I see the evolution of the open data sets. And from my vantage point, so looking at these 10 years that have passed, I see 3 changes, 2 that make me optimistic and 1 less so. So in terms of the changes I've seen, the first one is that we have moved from a single focus on open government data to a broader definition of public interest data. I feel 10 years ago, when you were saying open data, it was very much a synonym of open government data. And the topic itself was super niche. So when you were saying you were working on open data, everyone was looking at you like a huge geek. And what has happened in these 10 years is On the open government data side, I do believe we had quite a lot of progress. And I remember fondly like the race to the top that was at least happening in Europe between a country like France and the UK to know who was going to take over the Open Data Index. So who was going to release the best and highest quality data between these two governments. Today, the situation has, we have seen a backlash happening in the US, but some governments are still pushing towards this. On the public interest data side, data overall has become more democratized, and I would say, in my opinion, that data literacy has improved. What makes me hopeful today is that when I see a community of patients, like working together, especially when we are talking about disease like long COVID or rare disease, working together to pull together data sets about their condition. And this was not happening 10 years ago. I also see initiatives like the Open Food Facts, stepping in where you don't have like good government data to build data sets and nutrition data. The second thing I see, and I will be quick, is, and this makes me hopeful, I feel 10 years ago, the open data and open source community were each evolving in their own corner. And today, what you see on a platform like Hugging Face is that these communities are coming together. You have data sets being published, and you have open source LLM creator using them. And one good example of this, in my opinion, is Common Corpus that has been developed by Pleias using data in the public domain to help train open source LLMs. So that's something pretty interesting. I also see interesting example of this in linguistic diversity, but happy to share those after. However, I will maybe finish with one negative point, but yeah, you wanted to.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'll go on to Michele next. Finish your thought, and we'll come back and panel to my question.
Yeah, the last maybe what makes me less optimistic today is that I feel we have a lot of easy reason not to open up data. When I was working in the French government, it was really tough to open data because you didn't really know what people were going to do with that data. And today, the issue is a bit different. You have this fear that if you open data, it's going to get scrapped because of how GenAI was created. And I think this is creating fears and a discourse that makes it harder for open data advocates to publish. So I worry a bit about this discourse and this narrative. And I will stop there. Happy to answer question later.
That's great. Thank you, Claire. And I'll come. I have like 5 questions, but I want to make sure we get everyone a chance to talk before we go to panel. So Michele, like when Claire mentioned AlphaFold and PDB, you've been at the Omidyar Network. Your work focuses on improving the impact of technologies for society, right? That AlphaFold data is fair data, right? And it's relatively easy because it's protein structure data. It doesn't have privacy needs. It's hard to hurt the proteins. Can you talk a little bit about, given your legal and policy expertise, what kind of coalition building would improve policy development for fair access for AI, while recognizing that not all data is as easy to work with as protein structures?
So first off, I want to say thank you so much to Stefan and the entire GovLab team. And I want to apologize to Jeremy because I think both Claire, Venkatesh, and myself were all former Googlers, and you're the Microsoft guys. So I don't know what's happening. Stefan has to work on diversity of perspectives here. But seriously, one of the reasons why I'm so excited that we're having this conversation today is that I think it's essential because we're talking about something that's often overlooked, which is there's this profound interconnection between AI and data. And it's not just a question of AI for data or data for AI, but it's understanding how these forces work together and how openness really unlocks that potential. And I so appreciated Amandeep earlier in his comments that actually we have to get better on language around openness because of some of the fuzziness around the term. And so at ON, we're really thinking about this every day, how we look at how AI can collect and analyze and share data. It makes it more accessible, more useful, more actionable. You gave the AlphaFold example, but at the same time, we recognize open data is actually the lifeblood that makes those systems possible, that it makes them more capable, more fair, and hopefully more representative of this kind of diverse world. But we know that none of this actually happens by accident. And so to your question, intentional development of the type of coalitions that are represented here, private sector, government, civil society, academia, those require intentional choices about how you build and how you think about openness. And so we've done a lot of work at ON and investing in over 100 organizations who are working at this intersection that are looking at responsible technology. We're partnering with the private sector, Omidyar AI, really looking on how do we develop and create open license data sets that really benefit everyone. And I think when you step back and you say, well, what are the things that we want to get from coalition building? Because we all know it's a hard skill, right? It's something that we have to develop. But it's going to improve the policy landscape, stakeholder alignment, legitimacy, and you get obvious buy-in. And what often happens, and I think so many of us have been at these conferences, we all show up and we have our different perspectives, but there's no buy-in across coalitions or perspectives. You often see missing the kind of technical expertise and integration. So I was trained as a legal theorist, but I spent a good chunk of my professional career right next to engineers. And what often happens is there is a missed opportunity for shared domain knowledge. And so unless we can get serious about that, you miss opportunities on metadata standards and API protocols and data format specifications that actually make these data sets real for people, findable and interoperable, and actually lead to the type of changes that we want to see in civil society. We all say we want this to work in service of the public interest, but there's intentional choices there. And so I think as a whole, this gives us the opportunity for more pooling, more resources, and ultimately better implementation capacity. So you get to see shared funding, pilot programs happening in real time, and that makes for a better, more inclusive system of openness for everyone.
And Michele, given the portfolio you've got, and you know, especially the way that it's working out into some of the big frontier AI companies, right? What are you seeing in terms of emerging governance models or frameworks that are useful for open data and AI?
Well, I think it's actually a really exciting time. I think 20 years ago, you didn't have the public consciousness about the need for conversations about guardrails and standards and shared governance. And so you're actually seeing companies like Jeremy's Microsoft and Anthropic and OpenAI, who are doing a few different things. So you're seeing cascading review systems, technical boards, ethics committees, external advisors, and greater executive accountability. I think one of the things we want to see more risk-based classification to kind of streamline low impact applications and looking at higher extensive review for high stakes deployment. At the end of the day, what we're really asking and what we're really saying is we're having a massive social experiment that is occurring in real time. And we have to ask, what does it mean when for that type of deployment? So I'm excited because we're seeing more formal partnerships. There's a lot more work that needs to be done there because what often happens is things are done to affected communities and not with them. And so we need real consequential advisory roles and co-design processes. And it can happen. We've seen it done. There are examples coming all out from public sector. And I think what's going to happen this time is this is not going to be led by governments. I think we're going to have to see the multi-stakeholder coalitions coming together. And I think civil society is going to play a really important role in pushing for this. And I think if we also look at industry consortia all moving in the same direction for these type of ethical standards and bias testing and data sharing protocols, what ends up happening is there's almost, I'll use the parlance of the young people, FOMO, right? All the companies who are doing the right thing are moving in the right direction, and we want to highlight that. We want to talk about that. And others who are not, they're missing out. And we want people to see the distinction between those two sides.
That's a great answer. I hear public interest technology underneath a lot of this, right? And I will note I'm married to a lawyer who works with engineers. It's one of my favorite patterns out there is policy and engineers in the same room.
That's right. We have a good time. It's a party.
That's right. And so Venkatesh, and another ex-Googler, right? So you've written recently about the importance of national AI strategies, which include approaches to accessible and secure data. This is important to me. Not only am I married to a lawyer, I'm married to a Brazilian lawyer. So I spent a lot of time in Brazil. And so, in this moment, right, how do you recommend to a country with partial or limited AI capabilities, which is, I think, honestly, everyone has partial or limited AI capabilities? How do you recommend creating an open data strategy in this kind of world?
So I would classify the data problem into two sets. One is personal data, the other is non-personal data. In India, we now have a data protection law, and therefore, any personal data that has to be shared has to be driven by consent. So for that, we have built a very unique system, which is called the account aggregator. And in this account aggregator model, what happens is that data that is around the financial sector, so whether it's my banking data, my mutual funds, my insurance, my provident fund, etc., all that can be shared with third parties using a consent network. So let's say a bank wants to offer me a loan. They'll send me a request and I'll approve that request and then share my data with them, and then they run their algorithms and come back to me with an offer. And I could get an offer from, say, 3-4 different organizations. And so this is basically a system where AI is used at the back end using consented data flows to give loan offers and other financial services to individuals. I also advise a couple of open source AI projects in India. There is the Telugu LLM. Telugu is a language spoken by about 96 million people. There is the Tamil LLM project. That's again a language which is spoken by 80 million people. Now, the challenge in India, and I assume this is also true for many other countries, is that digital data in these languages is very, very limited. In Tamil, for example, it's estimated that you need about 15 trillion tokens to train a Tamil LLM. And the current level of data available is only about 20 billion tokens. And that set of data itself is very, very poor in quality because people type using the English keyboard. So they type in Tamil using the English keyboard. So what the digital data that you have is a hodgepodge. Some communities are trying to solve that in India by community-driven data collection methods. There is the Telugu group. What they have done is that they got about 45,000 volunteers to contribute about 1.5 million voice samples and use that to drive the automated speech recognition systems. I think in India, we will have to do more of these kind of curated high quality data collection drives. And thankfully, we have a huge population of students, etc., that can be harnessed. It's incredibly hard work, but it's possible to do that. The other issue which I want to mention is that, it's, this kind of effort can only be done by the government. I think, governments have to realize that this is a very critical point in time for their languages. If we do not invest in creating digital data sets that are open access, open source, these very languages might be at, threat of extinction. Tamil, for example, is a language that is 2,500 years old. There is a deep history of literature and culture in the Tamil language and in many other Indian languages. But if we do not digitize the linguistic heritage of these languages, we will end up losing them at some point in time. So if we do not invest in creating data sets in these languages, I think, and it's only the government that can invest in creating these data sets as public goods, because no private party will say, I will create this and make it available. The other quick point I want to make is that there is also a concern that when community comes in and creates all these data sets and makes them available, the private sector should not end up being free riders on top of that. We are creating this data for the community, for the benefit of all of humanity. Therefore, we are thinking of things like share and share alike licenses, where the data sets will be available for open source LLMs to use, but if it is not an open source LLM, these data sets would not be usable. So I think these are the kind of I think the final point I'd make is that governments are the largest creator of data sets. So if those data sets are made cleanly available in a machine readable, AI usable format, I think that also is something that needs to be pushed very aggressively. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Venkatesh. There's so much to dig into that we're not going to even have time to. We're going to have like one question in group, so I apologize, but I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. So Jeremy, I've worked with Microsoft. Microsoft's a global leader. Lots of companies follow Microsoft, right? Especially on open policy and research spaces. So, how do you at Microsoft think about the role of the private sector in advocating for these responsible open data frameworks?
Well, thank you for the question, and thanks again for the chance to be here, because this, during my day job, I'm looking at EU policy topics, many of which really overlap with this space. And I think some of the political stakeholders and some of the wider community that we work with are looking at this opportunity similarly, and it's certainly accelerated over the past several years. It's a space where I think there's a lot of like-minded views on where the opportunity is. And technology has done a lot to address even some of the reservations and maybe even some of the challenges that emerge in that space. So it's one of my favorite topics to address, and appreciate the chance to be able to be here. And much has been said a bit already, and I appreciate all my ex-Googlers' views. I work a lot with some of our competitors in this space still, because I do think there's opportunities for all of us to benefit. But I think Microsoft, at least in terms of where we've seen our role, this goes back to a campaign that I was privileged to be a part of all the way back in 2020 when we launched an open data campaign. And we've been advocating for more open data so that every organization can innovate and do more. This includes our customers, naturally, but also startups, open source developers, research communities, and all the organizations that we work with. Why it was exciting then is, when we think about so many of the digital technologies and of course the importance of data, different type of conversations always come up. We've seen developers and researchers get really excited about what can be done with data. And what I used to say is there'd be all this excitement, and then the lawyers would get involved and things would often slow down. And there's legislative frameworks that implicate that and the like. But I think where we're excited is about not just the growing importance of data to the success of many of these initiatives, but where technology can also hopefully mitigate some of the reservations and some of the risks therein. So data is more important than ever, and I think our commitments to open data is more important than ever in an AI era, where vast and varied data sets are needed not just to minimize risk and bias, but to produce the most accurate outcomes. Varied data makes AI more inclusive of languages. That's been said already a bit here, and we've made some announcements in that space, but different institutions, different cultures, and of course, context-specific data. You need that to maybe ground and fine-tune some of these models that are relevant to a specific task. We still, of course, hear concerns about privacy and security that would go to that example I mentioned with the lawyers and even some of our customers that hinder data sharing in that context. I think it's really easy to say, we need this data and there's a big opportunity, but of course there are compliance considerations there and real risks around privacy and security. That goes a bit to what I was saying. I think technology has managed to hopefully advance a bit more, where we have some technological solutions now that can mitigate some of those risks. But nonetheless, it's important that we participate in dialogues like this on what responsible practices look like there. There are different solutions and different standards that motivate different sets of stakeholders. And we want to share the options that we think address these concerns through data governance frameworks or some of the privacy preserving techniques that I know many of our researchers and partners that we work with have helped develop. One example of this is, I think, more important than ever, and where our campaign has matured in that space, is really the important role of open data commons. So, these are pools of data that are managed by an organization or community in the public's interest. And we're more committed than ever to supporting the establishment of open data commons that provide that high quality context-specific data for AI model training. And I think when we were talking about this in 2020, I don't think we were even aware just how quickly generative AI was around the corner and was making this realer than ever. So some of what we were doing in 2020, and we were looking at data analytics tools, and back then we talked a lot about big data and text and data mining. We weren't talking generative AI at the time, and I think things have accelerated tremendously there. So more important than ever, and I think remain committed, not just in the open data context, but these data commons that now become more important than ever when folks are talking about either scarcity of data or different levels of access to this data. We've called out big companies before. Big companies may be sitting on more data than smaller players who might even have better ideas. So we used to say that it's really unlikely that any one organization has enough data on their own to be successful at AI. But when you look at some smaller players in particular, they're even less in a position to have enough data on their own to be successful at AI, and particularly generative AI, when we're thinking about the vast data sets that are needed. So data sharing is going to be more important than ever, and it needs to be done in a way, as we mentioned, addresses those risks, addresses those reservations. And we want to commit to supporting more of the establishment of data commons that can go away towards, I think, addressing some of what I just mentioned. So we're collaborating with the GovLab in particular on a new commons challenge to support organizations that are developing community-driven and sustainable data commons for public interest purposes. Later this month, in fact, we're going to be sharing an open call to support nonprofits and research institutions that are working on solutions, including open data, particularly in the context of kind of my backyard, which is expanding the supply of digital content for low resource languages in Europe. Venkatesh, you had mentioned Tamil. If you look at all of the different languages and dialects in Europe, it's not just the 24 official languages, but regional languages in that context. And if you think about the way AI can help improve efficiency and transform things in a public sector context, well, the language tools need to be there and sufficiently there to actually make sure that this can be rolled out in those type of communities where those languages are present. And you mentioned some of the tokens earlier. I think we have some creative solutions that we're trying to drive and work with others so that we can do our part in sharing this rather than taking anything back from it. So I think really, if you remember two things, we want to emphasize that support for the data commons that can provide some of that high quality data for AI, and organizations that are globally cultivating data commons, community minded. These are things that we think are great and important to continue promoting and support. And again, I in the top of my mind, I'm thinking about some of our recent commitments that we've announced and what we're doing in that linguistic space in particular, to make sure that that cultural diversity, particularly here in Europe, but it can be applicable globally, that our role in supporting those institutions that want to make low resource linguistic and cultural data more open and accessible under their terms. I'm involved in this space on a daily basis in terms of all of the excitement around AI and all of the great ideas, but data is important, and where can that be made available in ways that are most accessible for some of these uses and the players that are involved in that. It's not always the commercial interest. Governments have an interest in this. And it's just a fact that when you think about the data that's on the internet, it's overwhelmingly English. But in that linguistic context in particular, we think there's a lot of opportunity around the data commons concept. And that's something that hopefully you've seen in the commitments we've announced. Hopefully you see it in the actions that we're going to be taking and some of the announcements we plan to make moving forward.
So let's stay inside the linguistic, and I'm going to ask each of you a different question around that, right? So in the Q&A, Claire had a mention of hack francophonie. Michele mentioned the importance of doing things with communities, not to them. Venkatesh gave us a good example in Tamil of an actual linguistic asset. So I'd encourage each of you to sort of react here. Claire, I'd love to hear your take first on, right, this is a very pragmatic and real example of how do we use open data to fuel data-fueled AI, and then how do we balance the risks and the benefits of the open data with an actual community. And so Claire, I'll ask you to speak from Hack Francophonie, and we can pull out from that. Michele, I want to have you dig in a little bit into what does it look like to actually work with a community. I come out of the rare disease world in many ways, and the joke there is warm handshake, cold bagel, no changes, right? And then Venkatesh, I would love to hear sort of, again, from your experience in India, like what do the communities there think it means to work with and not to? And then Jeremy, I'll let you sort of respond at the end of that. Then I have one question from the Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. We have about 20 minutes to finish up our Q&A, so we've got some time. But Claire, why don't you go first?
Thank you, John. So yeah, Hack Francophonie was a project I helped create in the French government to bring together civil servants across the Francophone world to be together to train ourselves on open data. So that was the context then, and in today's world, we are seeing is beyond just training. We are seeing more and more coalition to make sure the right data set are created in multi languages. We are seeing super interesting example in Africa, in India, in Indonesia. I was also made aware recently of a similar example happening in Chile with GPT Latam. So we are seeing this hub being created where not only best practices are being shared, but more importantly, data sets are being created in a multilingual way. I wanted to maybe just make one point here. I think when we talk about linguistic diversity, we focus a lot about data creation and the need to create this data. But one of their needs, and that's coming back to my earlier point on the open data community needing to work together with the open source community, is that we are in need of tooling in the sense that today you do have some of this data available online, but you lack of scrapper and encoder to detect it. And this is, I'm focusing like these days on East African language. And we are having like communities and an organization locally are telling us the data exists. You have a lot of like government PDF in local languages, but this data is unable to be crawled because we are not able to detect that it's in this very language. So there is also not only a data question, but also an open data tooling question. And it seems to resonate with some of you, so potentially you also heard the same thing.
Nice. Michele, so like everyone says work with, not do to. That sounds like something that's easy to say and hard to do. What does this look like in actual practice?
And I so appreciate you bringing this up because I think at its core, what we're really talking about is how do you improve public trust, both in open data and in data-fueled AI. And so I think that there are so many ways that we can do this. I always come as an eternal optimist because I think that's the only way you can be. So I think there are a few things. Practical steps, adopt data provenance and lineage requirements, right? So when you have comprehensive documentation of data from collection through AI model deployment, communities can see, they understand what the collection methodology was. Researchers who are from those communities can then speak and talk about what the model training processes have been and validate those procedures. I think we've had a number of conversations writ large as a society around algorithmic impact assessments, but I think what you want to see is there's some amount of pre-deployment bias and fairness testing. I think if communities feel like from the start, I am invisible in the data is biasing who I am and how I show up in a global context, then you're never going to build the public trust you need. So what does that mean? Ongoing monitoring and reporting requirements and independent third-party auditing. I think finally on an individual level, and this is going to be hard, but again, I'm going to be a lawyer today, that we have to talk about an enhanced rights framework. You need to have the right to explain automated decisions and how they affect individuals. You need real, meaningful opt-out mechanisms, and you need collective representation rights and remedy for affected communities. And finally, multi-stakeholder governance bodies. What does that look like? You have to have community representatives from affected populations. I love the example that both Venkatesh and Jeremy talked about of intentional design, co-design with affected communities. It does not, none of the work that all four of us do happens and happens well unless you have communities who are there. You have technical experts who are independent of the deploying organizations. I think, again, at the core of this, we want broad consumer societal adoption and understanding. And when you have independent voices who are saying this is the future, this is the direction, that's going to be great. Bringing in ethics and social science researchers, and then finally having advocates and civil liberties and NGOs who are stepping up and saying, this is the path, and we see that. And so when you have that engagement infrastructure, when you have the co-design process, when you have independent technical advisors, you're going to see a shift. And I think all of us societally want to see the types of shifts so people have confidence in data and the deployment of many of these AI models. I think right now we're at a place where people will either take fear as a pathway or we can design something else. And I think what we're really saying is let's all think about how you do that. And I think there are so many ways that we can do that together.
Well, and sometime, Michele, I would love to sit down and talk about how we make those multi-stakeholder bodies, right, have the teeth that they need. But I'm going to keep on going, but I loved your answer. Thank you. Venkatesh, like, so I'd just ask you to react to these and sort of using that Tamil example and really think about, right, like, how is this data underrepresented? How do we secure access? And how do we then, as Michele noted, engage those communities as co-designers, as opposed to maybe thinking them as users, right? Again, I come out of the medical space. When you talk about user-centered design in the medical space, it's sort of like, animal-centered hunting, right? It's not actually inclusive and friendly. It's, you're trying to sort of convert people. So what does that look like on the ground for you there?
So the work that the Telugu LLM folks did is very educative in this respect. Telugu, so any Indian state, every 20 kilometers, the dialect changes. Every 20 kilometers, the type of food you eat also changes. So every Indian state has massive diversity, even within a single linguistic formulation. And in India, basically, the states were formed on the basis of linguistics. So what we have done with this Telugu LLM work is that we have gone to different parts of Telangana, spoken to different communities, collected their cultural heritage in terms of songs, recipes, etc., and fed that into the automated speech recognition systems and the LLMs that we are creating. And just small things which would be missed out by people who do not understand the culture is, for example, in one particular part of in a rural part of Telangana, if a person has sore throat, they would say that my throat feels like burning straw, because these are primarily agriculturalists. So how would a LLM recognize that unless that particular cultural construct is fed into it? So the other part of it is that on the ground, when we go and talk to people and say that this is why we are collecting the data and this is how we will be using the data, I think a lot of people are very happy to contribute and be volunteers. And 45,000 volunteers is, in a population of 98 million people, 45,000 volunteers is a small number. But I think our plan is that we want to go to much more larger number of people. Right now, we are training about 100,000 students in AI over a 2-month period. It's a program called the Summer of AI. And what we have done is that 20% of the time of these students is also dedicated to creating text and audio content which can be contributed back to the LLMs and the automated speech recognition systems. So I think this model needs to be replicated at a larger global level across India and across the globe. I'm also working with this team to also document and do a case study on how they have gone about collecting this data, because I think this has got really important lessons for people in other linguistic communities. So it's a long answer, but I hope I've covered some of what you've been asking for.
Thanks, Venkatesh. Well, and I think you point out, right, 45,000 people, this is likely to need to be led by government, right? And Joel in the Q&A asked some questions about digital public infrastructure and how that interplays and benefits society at large, not just for the private sector. So Jeremy, I was going to put you on the spot as our private sector rep. But I'm sort of curious, right? Because if the government is going to roll out digital public infrastructure, generally speaking, they do that in partnership with the private sector. Right. So how do we figure out the balance so that we can get these social benefits, but also Microsoft can keep its lights on and keep running, right? So what's that mixture of roles between digital public infrastructure, the private sector, and AI, and how do they play together?
Listen, it's a fantastic question, and I think we like to look at where there's some win-wins there. And if we maybe use that linguistic example as one area where I think we all can have some win-wins, where of course we are providing infrastructure for some of not only our government customers and the cooperation that you mentioned, we've made significant investments in that space. And we are providing that type of platform that allows developers and others to have some of that affordable access, we believe, to build on top of what we've built and use some of the tools that are available there. I mean, on our own cloud platform, I think we're hosting over 1,800 models now that can meet a variety of different purposes. I think your question gets a little bit more at that public cooperation, though. And if I look at the backyard here in the EU, there's a lot of talk around that at the moment. There's some political winds that are blowing in different directions there as well, and those are challenges that we have on a day-to-day. But I think at the core, it's making sure that those who have some of these goals have the control that they need over what they're trying to build. And I think if I want to come back just to some of the linguistic announcements that we've made, if you believe in the importance of this economic opportunity around AI as much as we do, we want to make sure that the development of this doesn't have those bad economic consequences where AI systems that might not be able to understand or respond in a particular region's language, that's going to limit access and opportunities there. It's going to limit some of that economic growth. So if we're excited about AI diffusion and the economic growth that's going to drive, to make sure that's as balanced as possible, you are going to need to have that cultural diversity that we talked about. And when you're separating then maybe some of the commercial interests from where the public interests are, that public interest side is where you see the government's focused, which is why we have European partners and others that are looking into this space, devoting public monies to it to make sure that cultural or linguistic diversity is preserved. And that can be built and run on top of some of the infrastructure we're making available. But it's a great way of getting back to that data commons concept as well, where we think that's where you can kind of ensure that the data flows back to the communities, because those who establish the commons can actually be the ones establishing the governance framework that works for their community and their data. So if we're making some of our data sets and multilingual data that we get from GitHub and others available for reuse, of course, that's also going to have to be processed and built upon on particular infrastructure. But if you do this in that data commons concept that I was trying to emphasize earlier, that's a way that making sure those that are really most interested in the project and trying to drive the benefits for the communities that they represent have control over how the data is used. In other words, who has access to it, where is the monetization coming from or not. And so it'd be an opportunity just to double down on that data commons concept, I would say, to say we can do our part. And of course, we're a commercial body like any others, but this is a space where we want to make available what we can and what we've announced to partner to use these tools and make sure the governments that are trying to represent these communities have access to what they need. And I think the check on that is what I mentioned around the data commons, where you really make sure that those who are driving that get to not only benefit from it, but drive the governance framework that works for the use cases that we're talking about.
So we've got maybe 4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each of you to do a wrap-up question and try to keep it to a minute so that we can stay as close to track as possible. And I'll go Jeremy, Venkatesh, Michele, Claire, and let Claire have the last word. But so we've talked a lot, we've danced a lot around trust today. So 5 years from now, we've achieved trust. What does it look like? Easy question.
Yeah, great. If I had to answer that in less than a minute, I would say that trust in 5 years would be a successful data commons initiative that is leveraging different pieces of infrastructure, bringing together different stakeholders across different borders with a degree of certainty and control around how that data has been used, and actually making sure that the initial goal, whether it was enhancing linguistic diversity or cultural diversity, those who've been managing the project not only feel comfortable that it's met its aims, but that the communities that are there see that and actually want to do it again. I think trust would be there when we can show some proof of concept here that has led to some of those outcomes we drived, and people now want to duplicate that and call for the establishment of more data commons, more initiatives to see more and more results. So calls for duplication and repeating some of what we're trying to launch would be a good way of confirming that trust.
I love that as a metric. Thank you. Venkatesh.
I used to be a journalist, and I see this glut of AI generated content, and I see people forwarding stuff to me and saying, hey, this person has spoken, Elon Musk has said great things about India. And then I go back to him and say, hey, this is not Elon Musk's actual voice. This is basically an AI generated Elon Musk. So to me, trust would be something where there are, say, models like verified credentials where I can trace a particular content back to its source and identify who the creator is, and be able to say that, okay, I trust this creator, I don't trust this creator. So I think that from a content perspective, that's what I would be looking at.
Okay, Michele, what does trust look like in 5 years?
Government and public data sets are as easy to use as commercial APIs. I think that there would be a renewed public confidence in kind of data-driven government services. And systems would have the kind of increased transparent documentation that we want to see of data sources, decision processes. And finally, I think more democratic participation. In the world that I envision, and I think we're all working to make that happen, citizens can understand and their data use, and they have meaningful voice in the decisions, and that regular reporting from Venkatesh in his old life shows that we're making meaningful, pragmatic changes, and people can see those concrete benefits. And so seamless access, restored trust, and democratic participation. Claire.
Yeah, I will be in line with the last part. To me, trust, it's all about the people. I think it's about people. It's about lawyer working with engineers. It's about engineer working with community. So it's about not only breaking down silo around the data, but breaking down silo around the people. And to me, that what would help with this is also investment in data literacy to happen. So there is less a top-down approach from the engineers looking down at the user, but actually being able to have this conversation on an equal playing field thanks to a shared data literacy.
Claire, Michele, Venkatesh, Jeremy, thank you so much for your participation. I'm sorry that you can't see me. I'm smiling. I wanted to thank the GovLab for convening us today. As always, Stefan and the team there do such a great job pulling together the most interesting people on the most interesting questions. To everyone who joined us online and participated, thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing what comes out of the GovLab after this. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John, for being such a good moderator. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're wonderful. And we didn't even see you, so you're really good.
Exactly. Thanks
for
so
the best,
much,
Michele.
John.
That's for the best.
Well, I was thinking, John, we do gonna send around a picture of you to all the participants to make sure that they know who you are and that they don't believe you were an AI agent, but they actually are a real person that was moderating this. So thanks so much, John. Thanks for the participants. Thanks, Jeremy, Claire, Venkatesh, and Michele for wonderful interventions. The great thing about not moderating is that actually I can listen and really process what is said. And I think a lot of great wisdom was shared here as well. So thanks so much.